I really wanted to get a sense of how coronavirus had affected protests in the US. You know, in 2019, you had the so-called Year of Global Protests, where you saw movements in Hong Kong, Lebanon, Bolivia, around the world. And that was present in the United States as well, with March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, all those residual groups carrying on their surge of protest. And so at the start of March, when you have these lockdowns, you see protests just fall off the face of a cliff. And then as states in the US started to impose stay-at-home orders, it starts to climb back up. And then around mid-April, when Michigan, you started to have some protests there, and then President Donald Trump intervened, protests just exploded through the roof to a level that eclipsed any level of protest during that year of global protest in 2019. So there's a lot of anger and it's widespread, but digging into the state-by-state level data, it's quite clear that the biggest increase in protests is occurring in Republican states that are democratically governed, states that went to Donald Trump in the 2016 election, states that are important in the 2020 election, but have Democratic governors that are largely being viewed as tyrannical in the way they're imposing these lockdowns.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because from afar it seems strange to us, perhaps, given the scale of the crisis there in the US. On the other hand, you've got, approaching 100,000 deaths. That's a lot. But tens of millions out of employment. So while some people might know someone who was affected or sick or even died, everybody will know a lot of people have lost their jobs. And this concept that this is the bigger issue seems to have strongly taken hold.
Yeah, it really rubs against a conservative predisposition for freedom. We all know of the United States as the land of the free, and they're being told at the moment that their freedoms are limited. And as you have 50 different states opening up at 50 different rates, and within those states even different counties opening at different speeds, you have this picture of the United States where some counties and some states have more freedom than others. And for people who have been affected economically and who just want to work to provide for their families, this is a really, really frustrating phenomenon. But also part of the research, I looked into the motivating factors behind these. And if you look at polling, there's broad support for the lockdowns. What you have are really forces from the top pushing down, motivating this grassroots action at something called astroturfing. And that's really stoking up the anger of people who have been affected but might not necessarily otherwise protest.
Well, this is an interesting one. I wanted to ask you about this because you've delved into the protest numbers and lined them up against one of the more influential things in America amongst Republicans right now, and that is Donald Trump's tweets. At the moment, he tweeted, "Liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, and liberate Minnesota." Protests had spiked massively, but they went on to sort of double again, showing that Donald Trump both tapped into the zeitgeist and also inspired more.
That's exactly it. So this is something we see so often with Donald Trump. He doesn't cause phenomena, he responds to them and amplifies them. So in this case, he picked up on this grievance that a lot of people had where they were frustrated at being locked at home, and he amplified it. He tweeted out to liberate these states where his political enemies resided. And he's attacked Republican states as well. But importantly, he's attacked Republican states where the governors have been out of step with his messaging. So he really is an expert at times of identifying these phenomena and amplifying them for his own gain. And we're seeing that with Obamagate. We're seeing that with the conspiracy theories about Morning Joe Scarborough. And we're seeing just time and time again, even with the birther movement, Donald Trump didn't create that, but he amplified it. So these protests and the factor that Trump has played in them is just typical of the way the Trump administration and Donald Trump's life more generally have played out.
So what about the left in the US? They seem to have been quieter in the protest movement while this is all happening. I suppose the next wave, and you've spoken about this, might come with how the US responds in an economic sense. Who falls through the safety net, and that's when we could see things ramp up on the other side of the political spectrum.
That's exactly right. So some of the most prominent progressive groups in the United States, part of their ethos is the common good and upholding the common good. It's patently clear that protesting on the streets in a pandemic is not something that works towards that common good. So they've had to withdraw from the streets, and they're working aggressively on digitally retooling and really mobilising, because you're exactly right, this pandemic has not fallen evenly. It's affecting people who are disadvantaged otherwise, and it's just completely laid bare these social inequalities in the United States.